In the face of the ghastly US withdrawal from Afghanistan and its own enactment of repetitions, Julia Held reminds us of the mimetic impulse of empires to ruination, but which rests upon the catastrophic reproduction and proliferation of the colonial archive. I ask that we allow the civilian to inhabit it, even when absent, and invoke the anti-colonial inheritance that requires and will require of us continued practices of dissent. On a Thursday, April 13, 2017, the largest non-nuclear bomb, the mother of all bombs, was dropped by the US on the Achin district in eastern Afghanistan, close to the Pakistan border. Almost immediately, the cockpit video and images were available online, and the beautiful shades of black guide us to the topographic impact of the bomb. According to the US government, 36 ISIS militants were killed and there were no civilian casualties. The video now on YouTube and images document by absence no civilian casualties. Paul Virilio once argued that the distinctive violence of the aerial view is not merely an effective verticality, the exercise of exceptional violence because of the perpendicular distance from the battlefield, but rather because its violence is now constituted with the active complicity of the camera. The new distance from the battlefield, Virilio argues, required new technological mediations of sight, making the aeroplane and the camera inseparable in constituting the aerial view or the military field of perception. For Virilio, this aerial cinematic military field of perception, in this, the civilian necessarily disappears. Not only the question, who is a civilian, becomes no longer necessary to ask, it also makes us participants in the logics of war across boundaries of space and time as we view the film, as civilian soldiers without knowing it. But in paying attention to the techniques of the military field of perception, largely from the European archive of the Great War, he loses sight of the colonial encounter, the imperial hubris of the military field of perception, in which the civilian on the ground had already been produced as always and only a European, thus allowing Virilio to mark her disappearance. To give an account of the disappearance of the non-European civilian first requires investigating her appearance, even if only spectral. It requires asking, can a non-European be a civilian? And if so, when and under what circumstances? To locate this question, one must consider civilians' relationship to the racializing work of civilization as it underpinned formations of international law. Taking on the foundational 15th century writings of Francisco de Vittorio and others and scenes of European conquest of the Americas that justified that conquest, Anthony Anghie and a host of others have argued now that once civilization and barbarism was made the basis for sovereignty and the denial of sovereignty, the right to just war and the denial of that right, including to resistance, the right to grant exemptions, immunity, and the denial of that right to immunity, it opened up a dynamic of difference between worlds, European, aka civilized sovereign nation, and non-European, savage, subject, colonized, which has had to be constantly produced to demarcate one as universal and the other as particular. And this dynamic of difference has haunted the juridical and representational admissibility of the savage as civilian in imperial warscapes ever since. The word civilian, just as by the 18th century, civilization as a word became a law-bearing one and acquired its border usage in opposition to barbarity or lawlessness, civilian too emerged from its origins in the practice of Roman civil law and acquired its opposition to military, civilian as a non-military man or official, when it came to be used to describe European servants of the East India Company, not in military employee, i.e. the Indian civil service. And by the 19th century, the sense of the word in relation to military had entered into common usage. common usage, outside of its Indian context, that is to say, to denote the non-combatant, albeit conditional on civilization. Given that frontiers in Walter Mignola's sense were produced as a vanishing point, endpoint in the march, in the relentless march of civilization, and were always simultaneously densely militarized zones where resistance to the imposition of European rule was to be reconciled as a dynamic of difference between civilization and savagery to be continuously produced and secured through war as necessary. Thus, not surprisingly, for the Committee of Imperial Defense, while India was its most important preoccupation, the largest military deployment in the empire was always on the northwest frontier, where frontier governmentality and regular military expeditions against unruly itinerant tribes rendered Pathan society into an anthropology of fighting men and subject to routinized collective punishment. The film you have been watching is titled Waziristan 1937, or the part of it. And it is catalogued in the Colonial Film Archive with considerable context, analysis, and a substantial bibliography, and places the film in a history of the British military operations against Mirza Ali Khan, or the Fakir of Ippi of Tochi Valley in Waziristan. He is described as Britain's elusive, most determined, implacable enemy, whose uprisings result in inevitable punitive expeditions and air operations. The commentary and bibliography reproduce the imperial historical arrangements that attempt to secure our viewing of the film in a century of repetitions, of insurgency and counterinsurgency, from which we are supposed to understand the present as in continuity with that past. Replace Fakir with ISIS militants, for instance. I want to propose a different set of historical arrangements for viewing the film, by instead placing the civilian at the center of the scenes in Waziristan in 1937. So that, contrary to Virilio in a film on aerial bombing, we can see the struggle around it, around the non-European civilian, at the convergence of anti-war and anti-colonial struggles. And it is this struggle that we need to go to think the civilian that we are still fighting for. When Charles B. Anderson gave a military training at Abbottabad, in 1918, entitled The Destruction of Villages is an Art, he had recently returned from fighting in the Somme in France and was reflecting on how rules of normal warfare, i.e. European warfare, now needed to be adapted to transborder warfare involving campaign against savages. The art in Anderson's lecture was not conceived as a unique act of destruction for which artists in the 1960s would write manifestos, but rather as a honed craft with the intention of reproducibility. Training lecture was, after all, meant to function as a manual, like the many that stacked the colonial archive, so that even if each village was unique, the destruction of villages as art could be enacted over and over again as if it was not. Between his words, we can conjure images. In destroying a village, speed is everything. While it can take 4 hours, it should only take 2 hours. Or much time is lost in this work through looting. And then door breakers. And suddenly, to make us aware of thresholds of habitations we will know nothing about. In the first part of Waziristan 1937, that I'm showing you right now, we see the preparations and mobilizations for the ground punitive expeditions. The destruction of villages is an art. And the still images of shades of black and gray plumes on the ground, which you'll be seeing shortly, not perfectly timed, like the mother of all bombs, appear as memorabilia all over the archive. the plumes of black and gray. In a report on experimental firing against a typical frontier village, a typical frontier village was simulated with mud walls of up to 2 feet thickness at the cost of 5,000 rupees on the river Kabul. A photographer specially sent for from Roorkee so that careful records could be made of the effects of various guns and howitzers in breaching village walls. The only difference between a real village and this normal type, the report would note, was in the years that walls took to dry to density, not the hours they had been built, the normal type. The normal type, emptied of habitation and available for destructions, would be reproduced over and over again on the Kabul River for ground expeditions, and then onto the Hendon airfields in which Royal Air Force air shows would demonstrate aerial bombing. The typical frontier village was not a new target for aerial bombing, as some have argued, due to the mediated distance, the only thing visible from the air, or the distance allowing for greater violence from the ground. But there was something distinctive about aerial bombing and its relationship, as I believe, to the civilian. As Anderson would himself note in his lectures, the tribesmen were elusive, hard to see. They knew all the paths and ways in the dark. They thus routinely held the point of view where you can see but not be seen. Anderson, the aeroplane itself was a performance of this technological asymmetry, and the aerial view gave to the British that appearance of godlike imperial power, of penetration into terrains unknown and unknowable. If technology as a marker of civilizational difference, the aerial view as a projection of some kind of civilizational mastery or self-confidence, aerial bombing was routinized without much concern or certainty about its material consequences. What was of concern, though, what was of interest, though, was the psychological impact of its work. Frighten tribesmen into surrender. However, this projection of power was in precisely a period of extraordinary contestation in both Europe and the colonies. It was precisely in its ability to transcend traditional front lines in both Europe and the colonies, particularly in European arenas of war, turn everyone into combatants and therefore legitimate targets. The capacity of total war that was expressed in the apocalyptic images drawn of this total war made the airplane a symbol of savagery, a savagery that could be unleashed from within. And it's a time when old pacifists and new anti-war movements mobilized, coalesced around the idea of disarmament with the aeroplane and aerial bombing at its heart. It was also a time of anti-colonial movements, strident, challenging the cultural racial hubris of the civilized, uncivilized divide to make a plurality of civilization claims in arguments for demanding self-determination and sovereignty. They marked the civilian under the shadow of aerial bombing and became a matter of urgency and a need of protection. When the Disarmament Conference of the League of Nations opened in Geneva on February 2nd, 1932, it was inundated with letters and petitions asking for the total abolition of military aviation, all bombing from the air. And for a brief moment, there was a consensus for just such a resolution, the so-called Venice Resolution, that would have resulted in an unconditional ban on all aerial bombing with no need to distinguish the civilian. Instead, what emerged was the prohibition on the bombing of civil populations, the prohibition on the bombing of civil populations, the Geneva Regulation that would become one of the very few achievements of the conference as it dissipated by 1934. And here was the question. Could a non-European be a civilian? And if so, when and under what conditions? The real pressure for this lesser resolution had come from Britain's Air Ministry, and the Secretary of State for India. In other words, it had come from aerial bombing in the colonies. Why did they propose this exemption for the civilian when the only target were only villages? In the voluminous and frantic and anxious correspondence between Geneva, London, and Delhi, here is one of many notes that tries to explain why it had never been an article to quote of our credo to bomb the civil population, the condition on which civilian entered the Geneva Convention. Now, in the note, the Air Ministry official makes clear that this particular article of disarmament was decided on, centered on around European warfare. The word European is underlined in the original, to which colonies, it explained, would always be an exception where special measures would be needed. It is a bare confession that the civilian was to be understood as only European, and the resolution was meant to ease European anxieties of total war. The non-European was to be regarded as irrelevant to this proposed resolution. I used the word confession for the Air Ministry official was, of course, entirely aware of the universal claims of the civilian that would be put to the test, that were being put to the test. For he went on to further explain, even in these colonies, in these colonial theaters, it is misleading to talk of air action against tribal villages as bombardment of the civil population. The reason for this is simply, to quote, our policy is to give due warning in advance of air action to enable the villages to be evacuated, which is very easily done. In consequence, casualties to non-combatants are few and far between, and when they do occur, the responsibility clearly rests with those who have refused to act on the warning given them. Comparing European arenas to the colonies, the official pointed out that such a warning causes little hardship in primitive tribal villages compared to that in Europe, as a primitive tribal village had been represented again and again, emptied of habitation and available for bombing. The warning showed up this representation. Aerial bombing of villages could continue, it was announced, because civil populations from here on were to be given notice in time to enable them to make the escape from the threatened locality. So here are some stills from the first part from the film, that the sequence of the film I showed in the beginning. The pilot reading the text on a large piece of paper, or he is acting the motion of reading. When he turns the leaflet to the camera, it is evident the text is in Urdu or Pashto. He is unlikely to have the ability to read it. We as viewers are invited to read the text with the same level of incomprehension as the pilot. And then we are shown bales of paper being loaded onto planes with them floating out of the airplane in the air, billowing away like birds in the sky. Waziristan 1937. Waziristan 1937 is not a film that records the epic confrontation between the Fakir Vipi and the British, as the archive suggests. Rather, it is an alibi for the continued bombing of villages in the colonies during and after the passing of the Geneva Resolution prohibiting the bombing of civilians. The very fact that an alibi was needed affirms that the universal category of the civilian was haunted, would always be haunted, as a presence and absence by the non-European civilians that were still being bombed. Many of the petitions to the Disarmament Conference condemned this particular form of bombing on outlying regions and demanded the conference abandon this reservation in favor of a total ban on all military aviation. everyone understood the lesser as resolution for what it was. The challenge to civilian came from the frontier itself. In the 1920s, an anti-colonial movement emerged called the Khudai Khidmatkars, servants of God, or the red shirts for the red uniforms they wore. And they adopted a position of radical nonviolence, became allies of the Indian National Congress, and its leader, Bacha Khan, came to be called Frontier Gandhi, as his friendship with Gandhi became integral to moving this region from the periphery of concerns, of anti-colonial concerns, to the scenes of its struggle. There are a few studies that have studied the movement beyond its relationship beyond its relationship to the Gandhian movement, the specificity of their critique of colonial violence, the specificity of the critique of colonial violence as disarming and thus disrupting the colonial imaginaire of this epic confrontation with the savage that it needed, that was being continuously reproduced. This particular critique of colonial violence is one that is mobilized in the alliance with particularly Gandhi, in one of the first instances, and the reason for the alliance with the Indian National Congress comes in the wake of the Indian National Congress's stance on the very first instance of aerial bombing in India in 1919, overshadowed by the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which was put to intense scrutiny by the Congress for aerial bombing, including the aerial bombing, and where notably, while the word civilian was not used, the demand for the distinction to be made of innocent people was put on the table. In the militarized Northwest frontier, the vanishing endpoint of empire, the use of aerial bombing had gone unchallenged as a distinct context of a savage war outside even the bounds of Indian civilization. And thus, it was significant, the Khudai Khidmatkars, on forming a relationship with the Congress, brought a resolution to condemn aerial bombing on the frontier villages and the absurdity of these warnings that no one could read. And as such, it broke a long silence within Congress on colonial violence on the savage Northwest frontier. The real shift, the occasion of the shift was 1937. 1937 was hugely significant because it is in April 1937, with the aerial bombing of Guernica, civilians as front page news in a way that frontier villages never had been, came an organizing moment for the Khudai Khidmatkars in the Congress to issue a public statement. How does the thing that was monstrous and horrible in Spain become justifiable in India across her frontier? Whatever the so-called justification might be, frightfulness remains frightfulness. All over the world, people realize this and raise their voices against this new barbarism, the new barbarism of bombing civilians from the air. The word civilians could be entered into and demanded for the villagers on the frontier. In issuing the statement demanding civil status for Pashtun villages, in the midst of these British operations against the Fakir of Ipi, the Congress also made another move. It declared its support for the Fakir by calling for a nationwide Frontier Day to be organized on May 28, 1937, to protest the British forward policy of aggression in the trans-border region, and importantly, the barbarity and inhumanity of bombing from the air. This was a dramatic move to resurrect the savage civilian, as it had to overcome a number of colonial partitions that Indian support silence had been centered around, that the aerial bombing had rested on. It had to refuse the grounds on which the fakir's opposition to the colonial rule had been rendered illegitimate. It had to refuse the grounds on which villages that may or may not give shelter to the fakir and his associates could be condemned. The ground mattered. The ground mattered. The word in of itself could not give civil status. And so perhaps the most momentous move that accompanied this attempt to shift or bring civil status to the frontier was Gandhi's visits to the frontier in May and October 1938. Gandhi was probably the most photographed political leader of his time in India. And so when Gandhi went to the frontier, so did the camera. And the large number of photographs taken were meant to be public and to be put in wide circulation across India and beyond. Here are a few photographs from that, and Gandhi's presence in each of them is not accidental, but rather is choreographed for the photographer. Gandhi with a rare smile before the Khidmatgar, in front of a village home, in a rural undulating landscape, and another emerging from the rubble. In each of these images, Gandhi places his body and those of his familiar entourage, always supported by two women at his side and the tall and recognizable Khan behind him, in scenes that had been previously emptied, in repetitive images of exacting colonial violence on the frontier. The photographer, Kulwant Roy, who had gone at Gandhi's invitation to the frontier, could not believe the non-violent Pathan had even existed. And to such disbelief, Gandhi restored faith and forged a trust. To these scenes of catastrophe, he restored their civil status. This last image taken in an archaeological site is not about antiquity or art, as his body, along with others, emerges from the rubble. The colonial photograph of the frontier village of the normal type had been emptied of habitation, civility, and turned into archaeological ruin. Gandhi and his friends turned that ruin back to inhabitation, to life, and as such reorganized the aesthetic impulse of the ruin, to not view at a distance in contemplation, but rather to form community necessary to build again. These are active images. Gandhi always appears on the move, but it is the community that he walks with, the gatherings that form around him in these scenes that distinguish them. They disrupt, displace, and reclaim through practices of civil disobedience an inhabited and inhabitable landscape. I'm going to end with an aerial photograph taken by the Royal Air Force that appeared in the Illustrated London News, and it's entitled "Red Shirt Mass Meeting, Human Swarm on the Frontier." And when looking at it, one is forced to ask if this is merely a reconnaissance photo, or is it a photo that has been taken on the verge of catastrophe? Let me transform this image of civil disobedience. And I was going to invoke Ariella earlier, but I think the invocation, her invocation to civil disobedience is significant. The Khuda Khidmatgars, despite being banned, hunted, imprisoned organization, despite the bloody ferocity of the colonial state's power over them, defiantly call a gathering in the open rural landscape, just so that an aerial photograph can be taken that can represent the true scale of its mobilization and discipline. I try to color the image so that we can see the red of the red shirts that each and every one of its activists wore. A gathering so large and growing that marks the limits of colonial violence and an expression of its organized resistance. The gathering of red is seen from above. It's beautiful, so beautiful that the photographer who has his orders for surveillance and his photographs should have ended up in a government surveillance file, recognizes their civilian status, and is in recognition that he sends it to a newspaper in London, where the editor can hardly believe what he sees. Kulwant Roy's disbelief. The anti-colonial genealogy of the non-European civilian is here in this mass meeting of the Khidmatgars and the image in red as we see it now. I had a few things to say about the ways in which that this anti-colonial genealogy enters into the ways in which we have had 20 years plus of mobilizing around the civilian, but I'll just leave you with all the many attempts at giving an account of.